thinking, and not just a general scientific approach, which just means experimental and pragmatic, but like an obsession with science. It's often called scientism. You know, it's like making a religion out of science, that the only thing that's real is what can be measured. And this goes along with capitalism, right? It's saying that whatever is material, whatever is physical, whatever you can count and measure, that's real, that's important. But if you want to talk about a child's happiness or a child's sense of purpose or creativity, you can't measure that as easily. And so it's not as important, it's not as real. It's nice if we can have those things, but that's not what an accountable school needs to come up with. They need to show results that are quantitative because of this scientific bias in our culture. And again, I try to find I'll get to this a little later, how holism is a very balanced point of view. I'm not saying throw out science. I'm saying it has become overly dominant in our way of thinking, in our culture. A fourth theme of the culture is what I would call a restrained democratic ideology. So again, we have the Declaration of Independence. We have Jeffersonian ideas of democracy, that every individual should have a voice in society, no matter how wealthy you are or what your background is, what work you do. Every citizen should participate and have an equal say in society. That's a wonderful ideal. But in American history, and you can see it all the way through, Jeffersonian ideals have been stymied, have been compromised by a whole other way of thinking about democracy. In Jefferson's own time, it was Alexander Hamilton and the Federalist Party. I won't go through the whole history, but it goes way back. And it's the attitude that we don't really trust democracy all that much, just like we don't trust human nature. You don't want the mob to run things. You want people who are well-educated, who are well-disciplined, who have a moral sense, who have a stake in society, usually meaning that they have wealth, they own things. Those are the people you can trust to run the affairs of society. We don't want too much democracy. We don't like to think about this tradition in America. It violates our basic principles, our basic mythology. But it's a very important part of the whole political and social history of the United States. And I think it shows up in education. And when you look at, even today, Jonathan Kozol's work on the savage inequalities in public schooling, that's a reflection that the communities that have resources, that have well-established families, that have what we call social capital, they get really good schools. Their children have all kinds of opportunities to thrive in the society. The children who come from impoverished communities, immigrant communities, places that aren't established, that aren't as respected in our culture, they don't get such a good education. They don't get the same opportunities, even though public schooling is supposed to be, as Horace Mann said, the great equalizer. Public schools are supposed to be the place where everyone has a fresh start. That's the democratic ideal. But in practice, we know that it doesn't work that way. And finally, the fifth theme that I think gives shape to the schooling that we have is the theme of nationalism. That schooling exists to create loyal, patriotic citizens. So think again historically, the 1830s and 1840s, that was the beginning of Irish immigration to the United States. The United States, until that time, was almost entirely a Northern European Protestant society. To be American meant that you were British or maybe German. Very small minorities were from other ways of thinking in any other part of the world. But in the 1830s and 40s, huge migration of Irish Catholic immigrants, and it was very threatening to the leaders of society. And it was, again, explicit in the schooling that they set up that seeing Jerry always throws me off. No. How you doing? it was explicit in their schooling that we are trying to fashion American citizens, by which they meant Protestant, European white citizenship, a way of thinking, upper middle class way of thinking. And many scholars have looked at the history, and there's much evidence for this. So in these 5 ways, and you could probably name others, you can talk about sexism and racism and many other aspects of it, but I think these are 5 fundamental ways in which our culture does not, or at least 150 years ago, did not live up to these ideals of individual freedom and full expression of our humanity. And schooling all the way through has retained these limitations. So at different times in the history of schooling, there have been, you call them radicals or romantics or dissidents, reformers who have come along and said, wait a minute, this is a democratic society. We talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We talk about everyone's God-given rights to fulfill their nature, to fulfill their potential. Why do we have schools that don't allow that? And so people start little schools. In Boston in the 1830s, the father of Louisa May Alcott, Bronson Alcott, started the Temple School, which was probably not that different from Wellspring. And he said, I want to bring forth the spiritual nature, the deeper nature of the children in my school. I'm not so interested in molding them into the ways that the public schools are. Well, his school lasted for about 4 years before it was shut down. He made the mistake of admitting an African-American girl into his school, and that was the end of it. And this was in Boston. This was not in the South. Later on, there were other alternatives. In the 20th century, there were several waves of dissidents, of radicals. Some of them were outright anarchists. They got their ideas from European anarchist thinking and started a few schools in the New York area. One was in Stelton, New Jersey. Is that near here? Mm-hmm. I don't know where Stelton is, but there was an anarchist school in the early 20th century. So they were clearly outside the mainstream. They were just as far out radical as you can get. But there were also people who brought Montessori's ideas and Steiner's ideas, and people who studied with John Dewey and other critiques of this mainstream cultural thinking. And they said, we can do this differently. We can really give young people a chance to find themselves and to grow into who they really are and not be molded, not be forced to conform to this limited view of human nature that's in our culture. So during the 20th century, these different groups came forward and they started a few schools here and there. They were still very much in the small minority. And then the 1960s came along. And the 1960s, as you all probably know, were a major upheaval in American culture. The whole uprising on campuses and in high schools, the anti-war movement, the environmental movement, the women's movement, civil rights. It was a very turbulent time. And out of this turmoil, new educational thinking arose. And hundreds, if not a couple thousand, of what they called free schools were started. People started to talk about deschooling, taking their kids out of school altogether, which then led into what we now have as the homeschooling movement, which has, I think, at least 2 million families participating. Not to go through every detail of the history, but the radicalism of the 60s really got shut down in the early and mid-70s. The way I like to say it is that the empire struck back. The corporate, conservative political culture, the religious, all these 5 themes that I talked about came roaring back in and said, enough, enough. All of this craziness, all of this radicalism is inappropriate. It's un-American. We're not going to have it. And so you have the Nixon administration, and very shortly after that you have the Reagan administration, which produces the report, A Nation at Risk. Right? We were at risk. We were going to lose the economic competition with other countries because we were so loose and so undisciplined in our schools. Right? We We had to shove aside the legacy of the 60s and get back